Thank you, Children's Choir and the Praise Band, for your ministry of music. Very good job, and thank you for that special music. So we're continuing in our series in the book of Exodus, and to remind us and to really get us started this evening, God had said to Moses at the burning bush in Exodus 3:18 through 20, "And they," speaking of the Israelite elders, "will listen to your voice. And you and the elders of Israel shall go to the king of Egypt and say to him, 'The Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us. And now, please let us go a 3 days' journey into the wilderness, that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. But I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless compelled by a mighty hand. So I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all the wonders that I will do in it. After that, he will let you go.'" Tonight we begin to see this compelling, mighty hand. Tonight we begin to see God stretching out his hand and striking the Egyptians. Tonight we begin to see all of the wonders God would do to Egypt in delivering his people from Pharaoh. Tonight we begin to consider what is often referred to as the 10 plagues of Egypt. So our theme for this evening is simple, but just to get us started, a start to a study of the 10 plagues of Egypt. So tonight we will not deal with all of them. We're going to just really start with the first couple, as this is a pretty large section. But I want to begin with the verses that we ended with last week. In Exodus 7, 1 through 7, we saw right before that Israel, so God's people, rejected Moses. They rejected God's message, and yet God says to Moses, "Go to Pharaoh. Okay, your own people have rejected you. Still go to Pharaoh." And we saw a familiar excuse from the mouth of Moses as he speaks of his lack of an ability to speak. And yet God responds, and he still sends Moses. So this passage that we looked at last week kind of ended that section, but at the same time, it's transitional in the sense that it propels us forward into a pretty large section now as we think about the plague. So begin with a prelude to the plagues, and we're going to see this. We get two preludes, two kind of introductions to the 10 plagues on Egypt. And the first one is a prelude with information for Moses concerning what is about to take place. So again, this is the section we ended with last week, but it ushers us into the plagues, and we see it begins with this information. It begins with God speaking of how he will confront Pharaoh. Look with me at Exodus 7, 1 through 2. It says, "And the Lord said to Moses, 'See, I have made you like God to Pharaoh, and your brother Aaron shall be your prophet. You shall speak all that I command you, and your brother Aaron shall tell Pharaoh to let the people of Israel go out of his land.'" So last week we saw, this is a reminder that what God had set up. Moses is fearful of going, and further, he sees himself as having a weakness. Well, this is God setting forward a plan to help Moses out a bit, to give him his brother who will speak. But the part I really want to focus on for our purposes moving forward is that we see that in the chapters to come that God won't deal with Pharaoh directly. Okay, he's not going to show up in a burning bush to Pharaoh. He's not going to deal with him face to face, but he is going to confront Pharaoh through the agency of Moses and Aaron. But I want to stress to us that we need to remember as we go throughout tonight and as we go throughout these chapters, we need to remember the God who is behind these words, who's behind these actions. It's certainly not Moses. He's just an agent. He's just an instrument. It's God doing all that we see in these chapters. So God will confront Pharaoh through Moses and Aaron. But we also find, as we think about how, we think about the heart of what God is going to say. In verse 2, it says, I'll read the whole thing of verse 2. It says, "You shall speak all that I command you, and your brother Aaron shall tell Pharaoh to let the people of Israel go out of his land." So the heart of what God is getting at in this confrontation is, let my people go. Those aren't the exact words here. It says, Aaron shall tell Pharaoh to let the people of Israel go out of his land, but we're going to see starting tonight and in many of the plagues, the message is, let my people go. These aren't Pharaoh's people. These are God's people. The next bit of information that God gives to Moses is that Pharaoh will not cooperate. Look with me at Exodus 7:3-4. It says, "But I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and though I multiply my signs and wonders in the land of Egypt, Pharaoh will not listen to you." Pharaoh will not listen. So he's saying, go to Pharaoh with this message, but he's not going to listen. He's not going to obey. And as we think about what we've already seen in our study of Exodus, this is nothing new. Pharaoh has already not been cooperating, but we find God is warning, or he's given Moses a heads up. This is going to continue. This resistance, this refusal is going to continue, and it even reminds us a bit of Moses. As we saw, Moses has had some trouble obeying and going forward with what God has said. Pharaoh's going to too, and we're going to see in a bit of a different way. But notice again, as you look at verse 3 right in the beginning, notice who will harden Pharaoh's heart. It says, but I, God speaking, but I will harden Pharaoh's heart. God will do so. And as we think about this seems problematic. And we're going to deal with this in a lot fuller of a sense in a couple of weeks, because I want to see how we see this repeated first. So we'll deal with this. We'll see what this means that God would harden Pharaoh's heart. But I do want us to notice right here from the start, I want us to notice it seems problematic to us, but it's not problematic to the author of Exodus. Okay, if the author of Exodus saw this as an issue, saw this as even God sinning, we'd expect him to be embarrassed of this, to maybe not include this part, or maybe not to include it as much as he does. But we're going to see this as a continual thing that he brings out. He shows this is what takes place, that Pharaoh hardens his heart, and further that God will harden Pharaoh's heart. So as I said, we'll deal with this in a lot more depth in a sermon to come. But for now, see how God's in control, and further, God is in control of even evil and sin. The third bit of information that Moses is given a heads up on is how God will respond to Pharaoh's lack of cooperation. Look with me at verses 3 and 4 again. It says, but I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and though I multiply my signs and wonders in the land of Egypt, Pharaoh will not listen to you. Then I will lay my hand on Egypt and bring my hosts, my people, the children of Israel, out of the land of Egypt by great acts of judgment. All of these phrases in the green refer to what we often call the 10 plagues. Okay, first it's the signs, my signs. And this word sign speaks of doing things that are out of the ordinary, miraculous, to show and to reveal who God is and his power. So he refers to these plagues, these events to come, as signs. He also refers to them as wonders, my signs and wonders. And the word wonder speaks of a special display of power. And further in this word wonder is the idea of warning, that this special display of power is a warning to the people that it's being done to. Then God speaks of his hand, that his hand will be on Egypt, meaning he's going to do something to Egypt. And then lastly, the last way of speaking about these plagues is by great acts of judgment. Speaking of inflicting a penalty, executing a punishment on Egypt. So these wouldn't just be spectacular events. As we think about the things that come, the 10 plagues of Egypt, these aren't just only to display God's power. They're not just for God to show off. Not that he is showing off, but it's not in some way that he's showing off. But further, these extraordinary acts, they're acts of judgment. They're acts of punishment. It's a penalty on Egypt. It's a penalty on Pharaoh. It's a penalty on the Egyptians. And I want to bring this out here, as this is going to be something we'll come back to throughout these plagues. These plagues would further be a punishment or judgment against the gods of Egypt. Skipping ahead, Exodus 12, verse 12. Okay, God says this when talking about the 10th plague. He says, "For I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast. And on all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord." You get this another time. In Numbers 33, verses 3 through 4, this is said concerning the plagues and the gods of Egypt. It says, "They set out from Ramses in the first month, on the 15th day of the first month. On the day after the Passover, the people of Israel went out triumphantly in the sight of all the Egyptians, while the Egyptians were burying all their firstborn, whom the Lord had struck down among them. On their gods also the Lord executed judgments." So in these plagues, not only is Pharaoh and his people are these acts against, but also the gods that were worshipped by the Egyptians. And as we work our way through these chapters, we're going to see that this isn't made explicit. Okay, specific gods of Egypt are not mentioned. So to bring up this point, we don't want to abuse this point or put something in the text that isn't there. But we see that it does talk about the judgment of these gods. And further, I think there's two other things that lends itself to us understanding these plagues as God, at the very least, bringing out that who you worship to be a god is not a god. I'm greater than them. And two other things that just take notice of. The first is the fact that Pharaoh's magicians, which we're going to see very soon, they play a key role in these plagues. And there's going to be a connection between these magicians and the Egyptian gods. So we'll get to that in a moment. And then the second is the fact that repeatedly God speaks of these plagues being a display of who he is, showing the Egyptians who the one true and only God is. So as we work through our plagues, occasionally I'll bring up one of the gods that it's believed that the Egyptians worshipped, and how this plague would be showing that this is not a god. God is way greater than the things that the Egyptians supposedly worship. So as we keep saying, or as I keep saying, we refer to these as the 10 plagues of Egypt. As we think about those green words I put up on the screen, my signs and wonders, great acts of judgment, my hand against Egypt. As we think about labeling these as the 10 plagues of Egypt, we might be better off using some of the words that God speaks of. Signs and wonders done in Egypt, these acts of judgments, rather than the 10 plagues, as the word plague refers to, or it could be used to label some of these things that are done, but actually often, or most of these things that we often label as plagues, they're not diseases as plagues often mean, but they are what God speaks of them as, signs and wonders, acts of judgment. But since we usually use this phrase, I'm going to continue to use it as the 10 plagues of Egypt. But ultimately, we see that Pharaoh will not listen to God's response, and how God will respond is extraordinary and punishing. And then we see God reveals his purpose for what is about to be done. If you look with me at verses 5 through 7, it says, "The Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I stretch out my hand against Egypt and bring out the people of Israel from among them." Moses and Aaron did so. They did just as the Lord commanded them. Now Moses was 80 years old and Aaron 83 years old when he spoke to Pharaoh. So we got a sense of what the purpose is of these things from the words that God had used to talk about these plagues. But here very clearly is laid out the purposes. And just to mention them very briefly, the first is that the 10 plagues would be done to display God to the Egyptians. As it says, the Egyptians shall know that I am God. The second purpose that God lays out is that these will be done to judge Egypt. As it says in verse 5, the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I stretch out my hand against Egypt. And then the third purpose that God states is ultimately this is to get Israel out of Egypt. As it says in verse 5, and bring out the people of Israel from among them. So these first 7 verses end the section that we have been working through in these past weeks. But now as we look at them kind of from a different angle, we see they transition us into these 10 plagues, these extraordinary events, these events that are not done by accident, they're not done in random, but God orchestrates them. And he reveals to Moses, he kind of gives them a heads up as he ushers them into the throne room of Pharaoh. So now the second prelude. So the first one gives some information to Moses and Aaron. The second one, some people would actually even count this as one of the plagues. They would include this in the plagues of Egypt. I don't look at it this way. I look at it as an introduction, kind of setting the stage for the events that are about to take place. So a second prelude, a prelude of a slithering shadow of things to come. And this takes up verses 8 through 13. So the first point I want us to consider from these verses is Pharaoh demands an extraordinary act to be done, and God directs how Moses and Aaron should respond. Look with me at verses 8 through 10. It says, "Then the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, 'When Pharaoh says to you, prove yourselves by working a miracle, then you shall say to Aaron, take your staff and cast it down before Pharaoh, that it may become a serpent.' So Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and did just as the Lord commanded. Aaron cast down his staff before Pharaoh and his servants, and it became a serpent." So here we see God's authority right from the start. We see it all over this account, but God anticipates here, and further, he knows what Pharaoh will desire. As he says, when Pharaoh says to you, by Pharaoh saying, prove yourselves by working a miracle, he's saying, give me a wonder. Okay, same word, wonder, that we saw a few verses ago. But he's looking for an extraordinary act to back what Moses and Aaron have been saying. He's essentially saying, show me this God who you are supposedly speaking for. And the wonder God gives to Aaron, or the miracle that God gives, is for him to throw down his staff on the ground, and the staff would become a serpent, which should sound familiar. Remember at the burning bush, Exodus 4, 1 through 5 says again, "Then Moses answered, but behold, they will not believe me or listen to my voice, for they will say, the Lord did not appear to you." The Lord said to him, "What is that in your hand?" He said, "A staff." And he said, "Throw it on the ground." So he threw it on the ground, and it became a serpent, and Moses ran from it. But the Lord said to Moses, "Put out your hand and catch it by the tail." So he put out his hand and caught it, and it became a staff in his hand, that they may believe that the Lord, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has appeared to you. So this same type of an event or wonder has already been done. And further, I'm not going to read the verses, but Moses did this sign of throwing down his staff, and it becomes a serpent. He did it in the presence of Aaron, and then he did it in the presence of the Israelites to show them this sign. Now, interestingly enough, I want to bring out something just to help us create a picture of what is going on here. Interestingly enough, the word in this passage in Exodus chapter 4, when God first gives Moses this sign, the word for serpent is different in the Hebrew from the word that we have in chapter 7 of Aaron's staff becoming a serpent. In the English, it translates it the same as serpent, or at least in the ESV. But in the Hebrew, these are two different words, which is interesting. It should grab our attention. Why? Is this the same thing being talked about? Well, the word serpent in Hebrew, when Moses' staff becomes a serpent, in chapter 4, it speaks of an ordinary snake. That's what the word means in the Hebrew. It speaks of an ordinary snake. But the word serpent in the Hebrew, here in chapter 7 in our passage, when Aaron's staff becomes a serpent, it can speak of a sea monster or a very large reptile. Some see it as a cobra or a crocodile. The same word is used in Genesis 1:21, which says, "So God created the great sea creatures and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarm according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. So there in Genesis, it's often translated as the great sea creatures, not just an ordinary snake. In the book of Ezekiel, the same word is used, and I bring out this passage because Pharaoh, Egypt, is being talked about, and Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, is related to a serpent, very same Hebrew word as the word used for Aaron's staff. It says this in Ezekiel 29, 2-3, "Son of man, set your face against Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and prophesy against him and against all Egypt. Speak and say, thus says the Lord God, behold, I am against you, Pharaoh, king of Egypt, the great dragon that lies in the midst of his streams, that says, my Nile is my own, I made it for myself." So it seems like we're dealing with something different here, something grander, something larger, something that would have been very out of place in Pharaoh's throne room. So it would have been something for it to be an ordinary snake. That would have been still a very great miracle, but it seems like we're dealing with something that may at some times live in the water, something that is a larger reptile here. So it's not clear what the exact animal is, but we're dealing with something larger in size, something that was a creature that, as I said, dwelt in the waters at some time. That is what Aaron's staff transformed into. And as you think about this, what a sight for Pharaoh, for his servants to see. And I want to remind us at this point, okay, something that's important anytime we're reading our Bible, anytime that you're hearing it preached, picture these things. When you're working through a story, don't just read it as just information, but put yourself in the story. Picture these things. Visualize these things in your mind. Put yourself in the throne room of Pharaoh and just imagine Aaron throwing down his staff and all of a sudden it transforming into potentially a huge serpent-like creature. Imagine the reactions in that throne room, the fear, the shock. And I would encourage you as we continue through our chapters, as we continue through this story in Exodus, continue to picture the story before us. Put yourself there. Understand the grandeur of the things that God is doing in this story. So Pharaoh asked for a sign. He got one. But we see that this isn't special to Pharaoh. Pharaoh's magicians were able to replicate it. Look with me at verses 11-12. It says, "Then Pharaoh summoned the wise men and the sorcerers, and they, the magicians of Egypt, also did the same by their secret arts. For each man cast down his staff, and they became serpents." So Pharaoh calls his men in, men who practice magic, and they were able to do the same exact thing, cast down their staff, and it becomes a serpent just like Aaron's. Thinking about who these magicians are, as I said, we come back to these magicians. A quote from John Currid in his commentary, he gives us a further explanation of what this word means for magician. It says the Hebrew word for magician, Hardam, is an Egyptian loan word. It is an Egyptian title referring to a lector priest, someone who is not only a magician, but a member of the priestly caste and a teacher of wisdom. This is important to understand that we're not just dealing with people that are doing magic tricks, but we're dealing with a serious position within the Egyptian culture, and further, someone who would have been a priest, someone who would have been connected and interacted supposedly with the Egyptian gods. They would have been seen as being able to replicate this miracle with the power and the secrets of the gods of Egypt. This goes back to the point concerning God judging the gods of Egypt. So when we see this word magician, and we're going to continue to see these characters in this study of the plagues, remember as we see these magicians, remember who they stand for, the gods of Egypt. And as they're able to do some of these things, or if they're not able to do these things, think about what it would mean for the Egyptians' worship of their gods. So as we think about the magicians replicating their staffs, the question might come to mind, were they really able to do so? Okay, is this just maybe a magic trick that it looks like they really made them into serpents, but they really weren't alive. It was maybe just how it looked or something else that they were doing. It was just a trick. As we read our text, it very much so makes it sound like, and it communicates to us, and I think we should see this as they really become serpents. These are alive serpents, just like Aaron's serpents. How exactly they did so, we're not given that answer, but I think we're supposed to see this as they really replicated this miracle. And then we see the magician priests. They may have been able to replicate the wonder, but Aaron's serpent consumes the magician's serpents. It says in verse 12, "For each man cast down his staff, and they became serpents. But Aaron's staff swallowed up their staffs." So Moses and Aaron's God shows his control as their serpent swallows the serpents of the magicians. Pharaoh may have stood there smugly. So if you think about what Aaron did, he throws down his staff, it becomes a serpent. Pharaoh calls in his guys, and they're able to do the same thing. He may have stood there smugly, thinking, do the same thing. This is not special. This doesn't show us anything about your God. But now Aaron's serpent is the last one standing. It consumes the rest. And as I mentioned, what exactly this serpent was is unclear, but some believe, as I said, they believe this is either a cobra or a crocodile, which as they look back through the Egyptian history, cobras and crocodiles were connected to Pharaoh. So if this is the case, God is showing his complete control over Pharaoh. At the very least, this shows God shows his power over the magician priests and their gods. And the point that we really can see, this is why I said this prelude foreshadows, or it shadows things to come, is Aaron's serpent swallows up the serpents of the magicians, foreshadows events to come. After these plagues, God will swallow the Egyptians up at the Red Sea. The same word swallowed is used in Exodus 15, 11 through 12, talking about this swallowing of the Egyptians. It says, "Who is like you, O Lord, among the gods? Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in glorious deeds, doing wonders? You stretched out your right hand, the earth swallowed them." So this foreshadows things to come. Serpent being able to swallow up the Egyptian serpent shows that the Egyptians ultimately will be defeated. It shows their end is already determined. They will be swallowed up just like Aaron's serpent swallowed up the serpents of the Egyptians. And this second prelude ends with Pharaoh's response to the wonder that Aaron and Moses performed. It says in verse 13, "Still Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he would not listen to them, as the Lord had said." Pharaoh wouldn't accept this. He wouldn't let the people go. The serpent of Aaron consumed the magician's serpents, and yet that's not enough to make Pharaoh fold. But the text reminds us that God had already said this, as it says, "as the Lord had said." God is in complete control of his story. He knows what's going to take place. He's in control of what will take place. This leads us right into the very first plague. So as I said, this serpent that Aaron's staff turns into, more of just a prelude, more of just an introduction of what's about to come. Here the plagues begin. The very first sign and act of judgment God will put into place. And that plague is a river flowing with blood. So I will just say, as we start to deal with these plagues, I'm going to have some repeated phrases. I'm going to use some of the same phrases for our points, and that is intentional. That is to show that we have a lot of repetition in these plagues. So though the plagues are different, the author is very purposeful to bring out the repetition of what God is doing. So we start with the command, "Let my people go." In verses 14 through 16, it says, "Then the Lord said to Moses, Pharaoh's heart is hardened. He refuses to let the people go. Go to Pharaoh in the morning, as he is going out to the water. Stand on the bank of the Nile to meet him, and take in your hand the staff that turned into a serpent. And you shall say to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, sent me to you, saying, let my people go, that they may serve me in the wilderness. But so far you have not obeyed." So the command is given that Moses should bring to Pharaoh. Then we get a purpose statement for the plague to come. It says in verse 17, Thus says the Lord, by this you shall know that I am the Lord. Behold, with the staff that is in my hand, I will strike the water that is in the Nile, and it shall turn to blood. So as we think about this first plague, the Nile River was extremely important to Egypt. It was looked at and a god that the Egyptians worshipped, a god named, not exactly sure how to pronounce it, but Hapi, 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 is connected with the Nile River. This would have been the god of fertility. The Nile was seen as what caused Egypt to come into existence and continued to sustain it. That's where they got their water from, their main source of water. The Nile River was viewed as a god. And as we think about what God is doing here, he's saying, meet him in the morning, meet Pharaoh when he's going down to the bank of the Nile. And we can't be certain here, but it's great possibility that God sent Moses and Aaron to meet Pharaoh in the morning as he was on the bank of the Nile during the time he would be going there to worship his gods. So we've already seen Pharaoh's daughter going to the Nile to bathe, but another purpose in Egyptian history is that they would go to the bank of the Nile to actually worship their gods. So God might be sending Moses and Aaron out to confront him as he is about to worship his gods. We get a warning of the plague to come in Exodus 7:17 through 18. Thus says the Lord, by this you shall know that I am the Lord. Behold, with the staff that is in my hand, I will strike the water that is in the Nile, and it shall turn into blood. The fish in the Nile shall die, and the Nile will stink, and the Egyptians will grow weary of drinking water from the Nile. So the command is given, let my people go. A warning is given to Pharaoh of what is about to take place. And then we see the plague of the Nile being turned to blood is carried out. Exodus 7:19 through 21, it says, and the Lord said to Moses, say to Aaron, take your staff and stretch out your hand over the waters of Egypt, over the rivers, their canals, and their ponds, and all their pools of water, so that they may become blood. And there shall be blood throughout all the land of Egypt, even in vessels of wood and in vessels of stone. Verse 20. Moses and Aaron did as the Lord commanded in the sight of Pharaoh and in the sight of his servants. He lifted up the staff and struck the water in the Nile. And all the water in the Nile turned into blood. And the fish in the Nile died. And the Nile stank so that the Egyptians could not drink water from the Nile. There was blood throughout all the land of Egypt. So picture it. You're standing on the bank of the Nile, and all of a sudden the water within it turns to blood. A very different substance than water. One substance becomes a completely different substance. Red, deep crimson red becomes the color of normally clear or close to clear water. There's no longer rushing water flowing through the Nile, but there's rushing, thick, warm blood flowing through the Nile. You can smell it. The odor of blood fills your nostrils. You start to see dead fish pop up in the Nile. That is the picture. That's what's being done before Pharaoh, before his servants, as this plague is brought out. Then we come to the magicians. The magicians play their part, and Pharaoh's heart is hardened. In verses 22 through 25, it says, but the magicians of Egypt did the same by their secret arts. So Pharaoh's heart remained hardened. He would not listen to them, as the Lord had said. Pharaoh turned and went into his house, and he did not take even this to heart. And all the Egyptians dug along the Nile for water to drink, but they could not drink the water of the Nile. 7 full days passed after the Lord had struck the Nile. So the magicians, just like their staves turned into serpents, they're able to replicate this miracle. That water has changed to blood, but if you notice, their power stops there. You would think if they're able to change it to blood, if they had the power to change it back into water, that they would have done so. But instead, they just replicate this miracle, and we're not told that they change it back to water. But the fact that the magicians were able to do the same leads Pharaoh to refuse to let the Israelites go. His heart is hardened. So move to plague number 2. Frogs under your covers and your kitchen cabinets and everywhere. The command, let my people go. Exodus 8, verse 1. Then the Lord said to Moses, go in to Pharaoh and say to him, thus says the Lord, let my people go, that they may serve me. Get a warning again. So Pharaoh's given a heads up of what's going to come. Exodus 8, 2 through 4. But if you refuse to let them go, behold, I will plague all your country with frogs. The Nile shall swarm with frogs that shall come up into your house and into your bedroom and on your bed and into the houses of your servants and your people and into your ovens and your kneading bowls. The frogs shall come up on you and on your people and on all your servants. The author makes it very clear to give us this picture that frogs were everywhere. No longer just in the Nile, and it's not just that they start hopping along on the banks, but they are everywhere. In your bedroom, on your bed, on your servants, on your people, in your ovens. No longer just in the Nile, but they swarmed through Egypt. And as we looked at with the Nile, this plague seems to have a connection with the gods of Egypt. John Courage says this, why frogs? This plague, like the previous one, appears to be part of a contest to establish who was the true God. The Egyptians regarded the frog as a symbol of divine power and a representation of fertility. One of the major goddesses of Egypt was Heket, who is depicted as a human female with a frog's head. She was the spouse of the creator god Num. He was thought to fashion human bodies on his potter's wheel, and Heket would then blow the breath of life into them. Heket also had the responsibility of controlling the multiplication of frogs in ancient Egypt by protecting the frog-eating crocodiles. But Yahweh overwhelms Heket and causes her to be impotent in her task. She's powerless to repel or resist Yahweh's overpowering regeneration of frogs. It is the Hebrew God who really bestows fertility. He rapidly produces frogs so that they become a curse upon Egypt. God is sovereign over fertility, over Egypt, and over the Egyptian gods. So again, there's a God that's connected with the frogs. The plagues of frogs inhabiting the land is carried out in verses 5 through 6. And the Lord said to Moses, say to Aaron, stretch out your hand with your staff over the rivers, over the canals, and over the pools, and make frogs come up on the land of Egypt. So Aaron stretched out his hand over the waters of Egypt, and the frogs came up and covered the land of Egypt. So one frog isn't bad, okay? You might even look at frogs and think they're cool, or you think they're cute. But the picture, and I don't know if you can see it too well, the picture I have there in the corner, as I was starting to look up pictures of frogs, and especially pictures of frogs piling up on each other. And then as you start to think about, you go to bed at night and you feel several squishy things there by your feet, or you go to make some bread, you walk away, and then you come back, and there in your dough is a frog. You're sitting in your house, and frogs are climbing on you. They're everywhere. You can't get away from them. They're piled up. They're piling up on you. This is what God is doing to Egypt. So it gives us, the author really communicates, these things are everywhere. The magicians play their part in verse 7, but the magicians did the same by their secret arts and made frogs come up on the land of Egypt. I'm stressing they're everywhere. There's a ton of them. Now the magicians are making things worse by making even more frogs, but they're able to replicate them. And then a larger section. Pharaoh looks to the Lord, so we didn't see this with the Nile, but something new. Pharaoh looks to the Lord to end the plague and promises to let the people go. In verses 8 through 14, it says this. Then Pharaoh called Moses and Aaron and said, plead with the Lord to take away the frogs from me and from my people, and I will let the people go to sacrifice to the Lord. Moses said to Pharaoh, be pleased to command me when I am to plead for you and for your servants and for your people, that the frogs be cut off from you and your houses and be left only in the Nile. Verse 10, and he said, tomorrow. Moses said, be it as you say. so that you may know that there is no one like the Lord our God. The frogs shall go away from you, and your houses, and your servants, and your people. They shall be left only in the Nile. So Moses and Aaron went out from Pharaoh, and Moses cried to the Lord about the frogs, as he had agreed with Pharaoh. And the Lord did according to the word of Moses. The frogs died out in the houses, the courtyards, and the fields, and they gathered them together in heaps, and the land stank. So a few important things just to point out here. Pharaoh goes to Moses and Aaron and not his magicians. Further, he speaks the name of God. Okay? Lord. He says, plead with the Lord. So not just the general word for God, but Yahweh, Israel's God. He had originally said, who is the Lord? Well, here he actually mentions him by name. And notice Moses gives Pharaoh, he gives him the ability to determine when this plague would end. Pharaoh says tomorrow, and always when I read this section, as I was studying, I always wonder, why didn't Pharaoh just say now? As I was studying and as I was reading, the fact that he says tomorrow is an interesting thing, and even something that he may have been thinking, this is impossible. I'll tell him, do it tomorrow. Get rid of thousands, hundreds of thousands of frogs in my land by tomorrow, which may have seemed like an impossible thing. And once again, as we see the result, is that God gets rid of these frogs, but once again the land stinks. It stunk with blood in the Nile, and now it stinks with dead frogs. Piles of dead frogs litter the land of Egypt. So God gets rid of it, but they still can see the effect. And the purpose statement, so that you may know that there is no one like the Lord our God. And again, this account ends with Pharaoh's heart being hardened. Exodus 8:15. But when Pharaoh saw that there was a respite, he hardened his heart and would not listen to them as the Lord had said. And then our last plague for tonight, plague number 3. Bugs crawling over the skin of humans and animals. The plague of gnats or lice or fleas is carried out. It says in verses 16 through 17, then the Lord said to Moses, say to Aaron, stretch out your staff and strike the dust of the earth, so that it may become gnats in all the land. And they did so. Aaron stretched out his hand with his staff and struck the dust of the earth, and there were gnats on man and beast. All the dust of the earth became gnats in all the land of Egypt. So I say maybe lice, maybe fleas, maybe just some type of bug that is crawling rather than gnats, because this word gnat is kind of up for debate as to what it exactly means. It's a little unclear, but I lean towards the crawling effect of a bug or a crawling type of bug, as it stresses, or it says here that there were gnats on man and beast. You'd think if it was gnats or some type of flying insect, it would talk about them being in the air, as we're going to see in plagues to come. But here the stress is that these bugs are on man and beast. They're crawling on them. Get itchy just thinking about it. But frogs were bad, but now there's bugs that are inhabiting on man and beasts. And the magicians play their part, and Pharaoh's heart is hardened. Verses 18 through 19, the magicians tried by their secret arts to produce gnats, but they could not. So there were gnats on man and beast. Then the magicians said to Pharaoh, this is the finger of God. But Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he would not listen to them, as the Lord had said. So they couldn't replicate this miracle. Why couldn't they? We're left to wonder, but it leaves them to conclude there's a God at work here. The word God here for the finger of God is just a general word that could be referring to any different God. But they say the finger of God is at work here. So they may very well be referring to Moses and Aaron's God, or just saying something divine is at work. Something special, extraordinary that we can't do is at work. But it doesn't sway Pharaoh. So as we stop there with our plagues, there's two things I want to just bring out to conclude. And the first is that the plagues are to be seen as a whole. As I was thinking about how I was going to address this section, it's a pretty long section. As you can just see from tonight, we just looked at a third of it. It's a pretty long section, but I was pretty tempted to try and deal with all of the plagues because, and I tried to bring this out tonight. We're going to continue to see it. There's repetition here. Themes are brought out. The purpose of what's being done, a command, a warning. Things there's repetition, there's patterns, there's cycles that are being brought out. I believe ultimately to bring out certain themes, certain things we can learn about God, certain things we can learn about Pharaoh. So I was tempted to deal with them all, but I would have had to skim. I probably wouldn't have even been able to read every single passage. So decided to deal with them in sections. So I'd encourage you to come back in 2 weeks as we continue this study, because there's not a lot of application tonight. There's not a lot of things I'm going to bring out. There's going to be more of a conclusion after we deal with all of the plagues. But the plagues are to be seen as a whole. We're supposed to look at each of them and see with them together what they teach us about God, about Pharaoh, lessons that can be learned from all of them. And then the second thing I'll bring out is we have a battle between God and Pharaoh. Back and forth. God brings a plague. Pharaoh hardens his heart. He refuses. He doesn't listen. We really have God and Pharaoh in a boxing ring with these plagues. He's already been refusing, and now we have them. In their wills battling one another. We have a clash of wills. But as has already been shown, even before these plagues start, we know who the ultimate victor is. We know who ultimately has won the battle, and that is God. So I'd ask you as we walk away, just consider what this text has taught us about God. I think from all of these plagues, we need to walk away with an awe of who God is, what he does in these chapters. And then further, we're going to be learning some lessons about Pharaoh from his hard heart. So tonight, hopefully just whets the appetite for these plagues, what's going to be coming in the weeks to come. And then we'll kind of conclude in several weeks all that we see from the 10 plagues on Egypt. So let's close with a word of prayer. God, we come before you realizing that you are a great God, a God who is far more powerful than us, a God who is in control of all things, a God who is sovereign, a God who can do extraordinary works, but also a God who judges, a God who holds us accountable. And Lord, I pray that you would help us to walk away with an awe for you, with an amazement for the things that you did, that you can do, that you can turn water to blood, that you can bring about frogs, thousands of gnats all over the land of Egypt. Lord, things we can't even imagine doing. Lord, you are the creator. You are the all-powerful God. And Lord, I pray that we would walk away with a greater understanding and appreciation of who you are. And in your name I pray. Amen. Thanks for joining us this evening, and you are dismissed.